It's a pleasure to be with you virtually. I want to thank Gina and Kyle and everyone else for putting this together and facilitating the last minute switch of method. I wish I could be there in person to hear from all of you and participate in the discussion and hear from Yingling as well. But here we go. So I will be talking about transportation safety in what you might call the real world, or what economists call a second best environment. And I'm going to present kind of two threads of research here. One of them is more high level, and the other one is more in the weeds. And they both, I think, try to give effect to this. Okay, so the first idea that I'll present is really conceptual, which is what is the purpose of transportation policy? I think that's a question that people in this room have spent a lot of time thinking about, but ironically, the rules and laws that regulate transportation don't seem to reflect a lot of deep reflection about that purpose. So I think it is worth thinking about that. And then the other piece is more pragmatic and short, and that reflects the post that I prepared for the CTS that's on the CTS website. The first research thread is based in part on a book chapter forthcoming with Professor Jonathan Levine, who's an urban planning professor at the University of Michigan, called First Principles in Transportation Law and Policy. And it is about what are the legal barriers to making a shift from mobility to accessibility. Mobility being really about physical movement, and accessibility being about accessing destinations of value. And one useful way to think about the distinction between the two is what would count as an increase in either of them. So an increase, if you could drive your car 20 miles an hour faster, that would count for policymakers as an increase in mobility. If you could reach a grocery store on foot because of, for example, a change in the zoning code tomorrow that you can't reach today, that wouldn't affect your mobility, but it would affect your accessibility because most people value getting to grocery stores. And so that would increase your accessibility. And that kind of access is not really measured at all right now. In the key transportation decision-making inputs called key performance indicators, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then I'll get into the second best environment piece. So it may help here to think about two hypothetical commuters. Excuse me. They both travel on this road to get to the office. You can see the office building, hopefully at the bottom of the screen. And you can see they're standing there next to the road, next to their cars. And one of them lives in the middle left of the screen here, home A. That's where commuter A lives, and commuter B lives at the top. If you look at the road, they face the same amount of traffic. Suppose they face the same amount of traffic getting to home A. The person who lives in A lives in a close-in suburb where there's quite a lot of traffic between the suburb and the downtown where they work, but it's pretty close. So they're in bumper-to-bumper traffic getting to the first person's house. And then things open up a little bit more, becomes a little more sparse, and commuter B travels the rest of the way to their house, which is at the top of the screen, and they are able to go faster and there is no traffic. So the question is, who has the better commute? And if we were measuring it by distance, commuter B has the longer commute. If we were measuring it by time, commuter B has the longer commute. If we were measuring it by cost, direct cost like gasoline, commuter B pays more. And for, there are various other metrics like certainty and so on, certainty of timing that would seem to privilege commuter A for living closer in. But that's not the way KPIs look at this. So if you measure their movement over time, and this is a mobility as opposed to an accessibility metric, you'll note that commuter B or commute B has an average speed that is higher, right? Because in the early part of the commute, they're in bumper to bumper traffic, and then commuter A gets off the road. So they only have a slow speed. Commuter B increases their average speed because they have this area where they have less traffic. Percent of time spent in congestion, for the same reason, commute B is going to be encouraged by our existing framework. Specifically, projects will be scored better. Percent of distance spent in congestion, same, and the time buffer that's required might be a slight advantage to B. Sorry, I'm in a basement in a family member's house that has some dust in it, so apologize for the coughing. Okay, so the total delay is actually the same, because you'll recall that B is not delayed at all while they're traveling. They have a longer trip, but they don't have any delay. But on all these, so in other words, that's a wash from a transportation planner's perspective. But on every other one of these KPIs, which are all mobility based, commuter B has a better commute. And so we think, my co-author, Jonathan Levine, and I think that that's nuts, because no policymaker, if given the choice, would actually want to personally commute in commute B versus commute A, nor would they want policy to favor B versus A. They might prefer, that they can get more house for their money in location B, and that's an important conversation. But from a transportation planning perspective, there's no real reason to disfavor A. So we argue that it's worth thinking about, what is the purpose of transportation. We think the purpose is helping people reach valued destinations. In other words, accessibility. And accessibility captures several related concepts, including mobility, for one, right? I mean, generally, unless something is literally across the street or in the same building, some amount of, significant movement may be required. But the amount of movement that's required is not a fixed thing. It's going to be determined by proximity. And I think all of us have had experiences using different types of transportation in different places. And of course, what's available shapes that, but also just how close things are is going to shape that. And that's a question of proximity, which becomes an input into land use regulation. And then finally, connectivity. So I'm speaking to you without engaging in mobility, and I'm able to do that through the miracles of modern technology. That's an important factor as well, but we don't talk about that in our paper. We are really focus on physical accessibility, because so much of what people need, they really do need to physically access, whether it's groceries, dropping the kids off at school, taking care of sick relatives, and getting to most jobs on most days. Okay, but there is an important ends means distinction there. And what mobility, proximity, and connectivity are methods or means of reaching the end of access, right? So I'm not able to engage in mobility to be with you in person. If I were based in Minneapolis, it would have been easier. We would have had the benefit of proximity. But those are just means of accessing this wonderful forum. And so, at least to some extent, we can substitute with connectivity. The point there being that the end goal is access, reaching the value destination, normally in person, but in principle also electronically. Okay, so what does this have to do with law? Well, these KPIs are major inputs into transportation planning. They affect on the front end how projects are scored. So they affect prospective planning. A project that plans to reduce commuter delay, for example, would score very well, whereas a project that increases proximity, in other words, increases accessibility through proximity rather than mobility, that may not score well based on the rubrics used by transportation planners. Retrospective valuation and legal challenge. Ex post, when when projects are reassessed, or if a lawsuit is filed, for example, for violation of civil rights over, the siting choices of a highway planner. It's not a total defense to say that, well, we improved a lot of people's mobility, but it's a pretty good defense, and it is certainly will survive some levels of scrutiny by some decision makers. So that is a really key purpose of mobility metrics, is providing this kind of armor on the back end to defend projects from litigation. And also to shape their positive evaluation, which then becomes a feedback loop, right? If a project is deemed to improve mobility and is deemed successful at that, then that will become a factor for future projects. And then, of course, shaping problem definitions. The way we defined this problem is not at all how transportation planning agencies define challenges of increasing the ability of people to get to work. They think of it as increasing travel speed. Now, I'm obviously painting with a broad brush. There are individual transportation planners and planning agencies that are more forward thinking in that regard. But famously, state departments of transportation and highway planners and city agencies that oversee streets are focused on mobility metrics. You will find these metrics in every engineering manual under the sun, whether it's the manual on uniform traffic control devices, which I have written about separately, or the ITE parking generation manual, or the ITE trip generation manual. They really are all focused on mobility. Okay, so that's in a nutshell why we think KPIs as they currently exist are problematic. And that doesn't mean that they are the only problem or that they should just be thrown out altogether, but there's a real gap here. And we would propose basically shifting KPIs towards accessibility. And I would just, for purposes of this brief presentation, lump these into three categories. The first is what you might call city hall stuff. So things that require a permit before, as a threshold matter before anything can proceed. So in land use, bans on mixed use generate vehicle trips, and bans on mixed use, accomplish certain other objectives. Some of them, going to appeal to some members of the political community and some of them to others. But one thing they almost by definition do is increase the amount of vehicle travel that is required. I say vehicle travel because unless you're literally in Manhattan, that is going to be a giant share of trips. And that would be on the one hand. So then that then favors a KPI that measures mobility rather than allowing density increases, as of course Minneapolis has been at the forefront of some of these things, which can increase accessibility. And to be clear, it can increase accessibility of various types. This is mobility versus accessibility is not really about shifting from cars to public transit, for example. It can increase vehicular accessibility. If there's a grocery store 3 minutes away by car from me instead of 20 minutes, and that's permitted because of mixed use, or just more people are allowed to live close to that existing grocery store, that can increase accessibility even if people are overwhelmingly driving to the grocery store. And the mobility versus accessibility juxtaposition doesn't really address, quote, which is better, right? So I think it's important to say that there is a mobility first way to think about walking, like how many people can walk on this sidewalk and at what speed. You might think about that for like Times Square in Manhattan, but you will also find that the highway manual has a method for measuring sidewalk throughput, according to which an empty sidewalk that goes alongside a 50-mile-an-hour road would score very well because you can walk quickly on that sidewalk. It's just that it's very dangerous and unpleasant. So we don't think that's a good measure. But there are different ways to think about applying mobility and accessibility. And we just think accessibility is a better metric for capturing the purpose of transportation. Similarly, in parking, so parking requirements as implemented by most cities really reflect pseudoscientific knowledge about what generates parking demand and how much demand it generates. And those are all ex ante predictions, but there are much more sophisticated ways to measure and manage parking, especially with new technology, right? So there are tools that municipalities have, for example, dynamic pricing of parking, or parking occupancy measurements to see how many people are actually using spaces at different times and so on. And so thinking about occupancy and use as opposed to just prescribing rules ex ante can not only increase accessibility in general, can actually increase vehicular accessibility if it becomes easier to drive because parking goes up from $1 an hour to $3 an hour on a game night. Then that is an increase in vehicular accessibility, and we can think about how to mitigate challenges that presents to lower income workers, but parking policy is probably not the best place to mitigate that. Okay, liability rules. I'm not going to get deep into this because it's pretty weedsy, but basically the idea is, and I hear this a lot speaking to local government employees, that they feel like they need the protection of following the METCD or the Green Book or other transportation design manuals. There are some who have attacked that concept. I think it's actually maybe it's just my lawyerly background. I think it's very important to make it easy for government, for public officials, public agents to secure appropriate protections. But the question is how and for what? And the problem is the rules that guide those manuals are all grounded in mobility. They're all really imported from earlier engineering concepts where if you could increase the amount of water that can flow through a pipe, a given distance of pipe over a given period of time, that's just objectively a win. Whereas doing the same thing for cars may be a win, or it may not. It really just depends on the circumstances, but that is not how the manuals are written. It regards it as the same kind of a success as increasing the throughput of water or electricity. And then finally, there are a lot of what we call zombie mobility rules and norms. So California is ground zero for this stuff. They have a statute called the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, which was being used to actually, despite the title, to thwart sustainable development. The legislature put the kibosh on at least one form of that, which is the use of congestion as a reason not to favor a given project. But then that concept has nevertheless come back into some court decisions where instead of saying that a given project will cause congestion and that's why it can't go forward, they'll say, well, you need to have fewer apartments here because otherwise, the neighboring streets will have a lot of competition for parking, things like that. And there are other details there, but in the interest of time, those are all pretty high level, illustrated with some specific examples, but here are some really concrete methods. And I talk about these in the transportation safety and second best environment piece. And the reason that I focused on this for that piece is that all of those things that I'm talking about, these are in manuals that take years to draft, years to revise, years to be adopted. Even once they're adopted, there'll be some institutional and generational barriers to embracing them. So I think it's important to be kind of humble about the prospects of achieving major change across the board quickly. At the same time, we're losing about 8,000 non-motorists a year in traffic collisions, which is really unusually high for a country like ours that's wealthy and has a well-established transportation network. And that share of non-motorist deaths has been going up quickly in the last 10 years. There are a lot of theories about that. But it's important, I think, to just identify where some of the problems that can be quickly addressed, including by cities, that somewhat skirt some of these input processes that are like community meetings and so forth that require a lot of political negotiation. So, I think bollards, I've not seen a randomized controlled trial on bollards, but they seem to be quite successful in hardening sensitive areas. And they present an interesting contrast with other types of infrastructure that is on the fringe of the road. So if you think about lampposts, for example, and signs, they're all designed at the bottom to have this, they topple over very easily. And the theory is if somebody drives into one at 50 miles an hour, it's better for the lamppost to topple than to serve as a tree, basically, that almost instantly kills the motorist. And I think we should think about bollards as performing a similar function, except tailored to the nature of the risk. And the risk of walking on a sidewalk in a high traffic area, for example, in a downtown, is that somebody will make a mistake and go on the sidewalk. And so to protect the pedestrian, we need to make the bollards, rigid. So and the guardrails are kind of the same idea, that these are typically deployed for the benefit of drivers on, for example, curves and bridges, areas where a mistake is likely to be more likely and more costly if it does happen. And so I think putting bollards in downtowns, not only as an anti-terrorism measure, which of course in the early part of the century became standard around certain institutions, but really just to protect human life from both malicious and also just accidental crashes. Lighting. So at this point, about 80% of fatal pedestrian crashes occur outside of daylight conditions. And there are any number of reasons for that. You can think about either alcohol consumption or diminished judgment, but probably lighting is part of the story. And so emphasizing high-risk corridors, increasing lighting there would be really helpful. And I would emphasize the same types of corridors. They are probably different physical places, but areas that have a lot of pedestrian injuries and deaths for bollards. And then finally, and this is maybe the most controversial thing I'll say today, I think complete streets and Vision Zero are terrific goals, and we should keep working towards them. But I personally favor. There are two sort of goals baked into complete streets, really multiple goals, but two at a high level. One is safety. The theory being that if a street is safe for people walking and biking and riding the bus and driving, that's good for everybody. And so a bike lane, for example, might irritate motorists, but it might actually make travel safer for them. And I think that's, from what I've seen, that is accurate and a good justification. But the other rationale for complete streets, of course, is that it is simply nice to have a community where you can walk and bike and so forth, and that will be good from a kind of urbanist perspective. And I think that's great as well. But it's important also to realize that street redesigns are a means, and they are a means to both of those ends. And so they're not really a perfect way to get to either of them, but they're certainly not a perfect way to get to safety. They are quite successful at it, but we have 15 million miles of roads in the United States. And even if you sort of isolate for the highest risk corridors, you're really talking about probably hundreds of billions of dollars spent over periods of decades to remake intersections and streets and sidewalks and so forth. And, I think that's a great idea. But right now, again, we're losing about 8,000 non-motorists a year on top of about 32,000 or 34,000 motorists. And both of those are probably undercounts because they don't measure all types of other, those are on public roadways. They don't include parking lots, for example, or driveways. So it's a really big problem. And I would say, just waiting on bus lanes and bike lanes is condemning a lot of people to die, especially when we know that there's a great deal of political opposition and, frankly, fiscal. The money is not there now, and there's some more money in the transportation bill, but also cities are really staring down some dire fiscal straits in the next few years. So, I think we should also think about the steps I mentioned above, plus automating enforcement, seizing vehicles of the worst offenders, and other types of things that are simply more directed at safety and not indirectly directed at safety, but really are targeted at safety. We know, for example, that that a small number of drivers really are engaged in truly reckless behavior. They are not merely driving the design speed of the road instead of the posted speed, and they really should have severe consequences for placing other people's lives at risk. And if we automate as much of that as we can also reduce some of the adverse consequences of having armed interventions by police officers. I think it's only in the US that we would equate enforcement with armed police officers. And that's a really uncreative way to think about that. So those are some of the things that I would suggest, basically going beyond Vision Zero, because it is not sufficient for safety, and Complete Streets 2. And then finally, I think it's worth thinking about car occupant safety. I've spent a lot of time, I've written a lot about pedestrian safety, but if you sort of decompose who is being killed and why, in passenger vehicles, unrestrained occupants are now about half of all vehicle occupant fatalities. We don't really know why. Is that because fewer people were wearing their seatbelts? Is it because car safety technology has gotten so good that as long as you're wearing a seatbelt, you're going to be protected? There are different theories about it, but I haven't seen anything persuasive. Among younger people, it's an even higher share, about 60%. There was a bunch of research on the use of seatbelts and how to get people to use seatbelts back in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, before many states started to have laws. And so the purpose of that research was to kind of provide an empirical basis for requiring primary enforcement, meaning you can be pulled over for not having a seatbelt on, instead of only secondary enforcement, where if you're pulled over for getting a speeding, for speeding, for example, then you can get a second ticket for not having a seatbelt. So at this stage, 34 states have primary enforcement, but only in the front seat. Only 17 have primary enforcement in the back seat, which of course is where many children sit. There are a few states that don't have any. There are actually quite a number of states that don't have any enforcement for the back seat. The increasing popularity of window tinting, makes all this very complicated, and this would be difficult to automate as well. So I think we need more research on how to generate more compliance. What would be helpful? We need some experimentation here. And this, I think, is an important frontier for improving occupant safety. Okay. Thank you very much for putting up with my coughing and virtual presentation. Been a pleasure being with you. Please keep in touch. I wish I could be there in person, but my email address is on the board. I'm not hard to find. All the research that I mentioned and alluded to is on my Social Science Research Network page. If you Google my name and SSRN, you will find that very quickly. I'm available by email and on Twitter, and look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you so much.